Good morning, Seattle and Little Saigon. Good morning to everybody out there. This is your good friend Dan, and it is, I can't believe it, Monday, March the 9th, 2020, just around 8 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And where our podcast fellow human is today, that's a bad way of putting it, on the East Coast, it's 11 a.m. Good morning, Dr. McPherson.
Good morning, Dan.
And I'd just like to say a few things really quick. I am honored to have Dr. McPherson on the show again. Let me just describe his bio really quick, although I think it's sometimes ridiculous to do that and maybe even sometimes feels insulting. So please accept my apologies, sir. Um, Dr. McPherson is a professor emeritus of the University of Arizona. He has a background in conservation biology, ecology, the environment, and I would go a step further because it's an area of interest to me. I would say he has a really good background in systems theory. And I've often said to people, if you understand systems theory and the scientific method and you're good with math, you can go a long way to understanding the world. When and I don't know what his exact age was, but right around the time of 40, he came to the realization that perhaps the only solution to dealing with what's going on in the environment is a radical change in the series of relationships we have with nature. And his solution was essentially to go off grid to try to live a sustainable life, which I got to say is quite admirable. And also, he came to realize might be futile in the sense that if everybody did it, there is the potential that that too would have adverse effects, specifically dealing with something called global dimming and the aerosol masking effect. Like if we all decided to rebuke industry, all those particulates that are blocking the sunlight fall out of the sky, and all of a sudden our situation with the environment gets worse. I'm not going to butcher his background any further. I'm going to pass it off, let Dr. McPherson say good morning and say what he wants to say, and then we'll get into it. Okay?
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate that introduction, and it's accurate and kind. I actually was editing a book in 2002. The book was published in 2003 by University of Arizona Press. It dealt with climate change. It had a series of chapters coming from a variety of directions. And it was in working on that book that I concluded that near-term human extinction was locked in. And I was 42 at the time. Of course, I didn't tell anybody about it because I suspected adverse consequences would result for me personally and professionally. And sure enough, I waited until 2009 to start presenting that evidence, and I was right the first time. I should have just shut my mouth. But mistakes have been made. One of my leading taglines for myself: mistakes have been made.
Well, a lot of mistakes get made by us humans, but it's funny. We have just enough intelligence to convince ourselves that our mistakes are actually great achievements.
Yes.
Um, I would like to say something really quick. The last time, or rather the first time we did a podcast, um, I did my best to try to make it more about the interview. I will tell you, last summer was kind of one of my oh shit moments. I've had a few. In 2015, I had an oh shit moment. I was having lunch with a bunch of software engineers in Indianapolis, and we were talking about well, I don't know how to put this, but the possibility that human society had become so complex and the situation had become so difficult that in reality the system itself was going to fail. And at the time I wasn't thinking about extinction, Dr. McPherson. I wasn't thinking about it could fail for everything and everyone. I was thinking simply that human civilization, kind of like what you thought, but probably not nearly as erudite, right? But that human civilization itself was on the verge of collapse. Last summer, after listening to a lot of your lectures, which, maybe that's silly because you do a good job of sticking to an outline. So you cover the same material every time, but you also do a good job of tailoring it to your audience. And so even listening to more than one of your lectures can be actually quite useful. And after listening to a bunch of your lectures, I went to work and I did something bad. I printed out Dr. Shakova's paper on the eastern Siberian Arctic shelf so I could have some light reading on the bus. And and the thing is, when you read a paper like that, and again, I'm not an expert in the field, but I've read enough papers to know that she's not bullshitting. This isn't some, think tank person being paid $1 million. This is an honest academic that is basically saying that the situation in the Arctic Sea is so bad that at some point in the near future, we could get a massive release of methane. And by the way, listeners, we're already getting lots of methane release. We're just not yet at that massive gigaton level yet in short bursts, which is what Dr. Shakova feared. I will also say, because my listeners know this, Dr. McPherson, I have not made a decision yet. Probably for reasons we're going to talk about today, but probably because even though I'm willing to entertain the possibility that this could happen, I am still struggling with it. I won't be dishonest about that. I am also not going to beat up the messenger, which I hope you appreciate, because I think that's crazy. But that's where I'm coming from on this. Like, even to this day, I still sometimes see myself in that zone of bargaining, the zone of bargaining. And I'll add one more thing before I pass it off to you and we get into it. Back in 2015, I started, and actually this goes back before I left Seattle, but I started, the first time I'm back here again. Wow, great. I started noticing this weirdness. You know what a turning circle is, right, Dr. McPherson? A turning circle. Instead of a stop sign, you turn through the circle.
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, to me, it seemed like the turning circle was labeled denial, anger, and bargaining. And most of the people I met were just stuck on that circle. Like, it's not that they stayed on any one of those states, but it was a simple finite state machine. They were either in denial, anger, or bargaining, depending upon the day of the week. And it just became so infuriating. And this was not even about extinction. This was just about the tenability of this debt-driven society of ours, Dr. McPherson. What do you think?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we were born into this set of living arrangements, and it's difficult for us to imagine, having lived as long as we have, that it could ever go away. All we have ever known at the macro level, anyway, is economic growth, relatively sustained economic growth. Yeah, there's been a recession or two here and there, but they are short-lived if we believe everything we read from the economists and the newspapers interviewing the economists. And so all we've ever known at the global level is economic growth. All we've ever known is relative peace, for people like me anyway, Caucasian men living in the United States. There hasn't been a war fought on these soils in this country. And the wars that the United States has been perennially engaged in have occurred in other countries. And for the most part, we get the impression from the corporate media and the corporate governments that we're winning them all, even though I have a hard time believing that we've won a war since before Vietnam. But that's not what I read in the newspaper, and that's not what the corporate media, that's not what they're putting out. So
we're so close. But wait a minute, Doctor. We're so close to victory.
Right. Always. We're always so close to victory. How long has the United States been occupying Iraq now? How long has the United States been occupying Afghanistan?
A while, a bit. More than 15 years, right? It's been a bit.
I think it's 2002 for Afghanistan, if I'm not mistaken. So
that is correct.
That's a while. So if victory is just a stone's throw away, we better start throwing those stones.
So here's one of the things that I run into with the situation I find myself in. And maybe a good way to talk about this. I like movies. I won't lie. I've never had much of a. I don't know how to put this. I've been a bit of a hermit most of my life. So between books and thinking and movies, that's been kind of my own turning circle as far as entertainment and just thinking and movies and whatever, and a few other things. I enjoy my marijuana and my beer, as my listeners know. I'm not going to lie about that. But one of the things that I talk about with people is that when I look at normality, okay, and when I say normality, Dr. McPherson, I'm not proposing a moral judgment of good or bad. I'm not saying that the normality is good, or even that the normality is the result of just and righteous, honest work. But excusing the features around it, I think of normality as kind of like this really nice restaurant. And this restaurant is having kind of a going out of business type thing. Like for the next few weeks, everybody gets to have their favorite meal at half price. That's how I look at normality right now. And again, this is my way of approaching it. I have listeners who approach this different ways. My way of approaching it, given my situation, given what I want to do, is to say, you know what? If I have $30, I'm probably going to do something probably even a bit selfish today. Like I'm probably just going to go and get some beer and some weed and listen to music for 4 hours. And that probably sounds crazy, and that probably sounds stupid to a lot of people. But I got to say, it's one of those things I do because I have this thought in my head that there's a point in the future where just relaxing and listening to music is probably not going to be an option. And I'd like to add one other thing before we continue on this point about savoring what's left of normal. Dr. McPherson, I believe there are lots of people who believe you, but they also believe that the internet's going to be working right up until the last day. And you and I can both agree that that's probably not the case, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, in fact, as I've been indicating for the last many years that human extinction will be complete by X date, we'll say by 2050, almost everybody believes that on December 31st, 2049, they'll be tapping away at the internet and ordering takeout food from their favorite Thai restaurant. And that's not how things are playing out right now. I can't imagine that things will be following that path in the not too distant future. So I think it's a little optimistic to consider that things are going to hold together in much the same way they are today, relatively indefinitely or until a certain date. I think that we are incredibly privileged to enjoy the services that we have right now, and given their abnormality throughout the human experience and even throughout the last, say, 100 years, 20 years, 10 years, pick a time. What we're living today is, from a technological standpoint, pretty unbelievable. And we are enjoying this enormous privilege that, for the most part, we haven't paid for, you and I, as individuals, or at least we've paid relatively little for the experience to, for example, have this conversation across the miles, across the hemispheres, and at relatively low cost to us as individuals so far. Well, at some point, the cost comes due. At some point, somebody's going to have to pay for all of the materials we've extracted from the earth, from all of the energy we have consumed, for the behaviors of not only us, but our parents and our grandparents before us, who just wanted things to be better for future generations. And for the most part, better means having access to better technology. Better means having access to more of everything on demand. And so that's the sort of lives that we have pursued and largely been granted over the last 100 years or so. But at some point, the bill comes due, and I think that we are nearing that date.
But I want to propose something too, because I was having a good conversation with a friend of mine yesterday, and we were talking about the idea of downscaling your life. For example, I choose to live at a lower scale, Dr. McPherson, than I could. I could work as a software contractor 12 months out of the year. The last few years, I've been doing about 6 months, and that means that I can live kind of poor at times for a number of months, but it also gives me something that I considered before I even allowed myself to consider your position. I considered this to be priceless, and that's my time. As I get older, my time doesn't go down in price, it goes up. So I think that one of the things that's sad about what you describe, and I think your description is good, is that all of these things that have given us more food, more technology, more everything, they've also sucked our time, haven't they?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And for some people more than others, obviously. Some people have paid no attention whatsoever to the mm, large scale implementation of the internet, as one example. And for others, it's been daily, even hourly thoughts of how I can get the best thing going right now. But yes, there have been enormous changes in relatively short periods of time, and we have come to appreciate them. Maybe not enough. How often does somebody sit back and express any sort of gratitude for the lights being on, for the hot shower, for the internet being in service today, for the food that keeps showing up on the grocery store shelves or at the restaurants, for the water that keeps coming through the tap, and so on. On and on it goes. These are the kinds of things that we grew up expecting, and we have come to, for the most part, take them for granted, I would say. I don't see a lot of people around me anyway expressing gratitude because the lights came on again this morning.
But I mean, my point is, and I appreciate what you're saying, but my point is this, that I think these technologies have been great. On the other hand, if I compare my life today to my life 10 years ago, my weeks are longer in a good way. Like I get to do more because I'm not so, consumed by I must be connected, I must have the latest thing. I mean, I have a flip phone, Dr. McPherson, and I have it for a reason because I see people with their smartphones and it seems like the smartphone is using them.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. The technology has consumed us. Science fiction writers in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s were warning us of exactly where we landed. That if we're keeping score, the machines have won. Fortunately, we're not keeping score, so we can continue to believe that we have won, that we are using technology instead of being consumed by the technology, and as you say, the technology using us.
Well, and it's funny what you just said because yesterday I was on a rant about ratings agencies, and I gotta say, after the flash crash in 2010, I became morbidly obsessed with financial issues. I don't have any money. This isn't about making money. I simply became morbidly obsessed with the system in the sense that I began to realize that if you really want to understand the economic system, it's almost better to approach it from the perspective of a forensic accountant than it does to approach it from like a classical Adam Smith type thing. And I was thinking about this yesterday, this issue of ratings agencies. And it's funny, you have these ratings agencies that are supposed to keep score, Dr. McPherson, okay? If let's say you have a bond, like a junk bond that you use to finance your shale operation, a ratings agency should look out for the bondholders. I would think. Don't you think so?
Oh, yes. That's what they're there for.
Yeah, exactly. But in the last 10 years, especially the last 10 years, the ratings agencies have done everything they can, whether it was the Greek crisis in 2012, whether it's the multiple cases with stuff like shale, whether it's all the corporate bonds out there that are really just worse than junk. The ratings agencies have done a great job to convince people that a shit sandwich is a shrimp salad. And that's keeping score. That keeping score is really broken in that world. It's just funny when you said that. I almost think that we've convinced ourselves the best way to win is just not to keep score.
Right. And, without getting into conspiracy theory, something I've often accused of doing for pursuing evidence, it could be that those rating agencies have in mind the benefits of a few people rather than the majority of people. And so maybe they are giving us messages and conducting operations in a manner that benefits a relatively few instead of the many.
Yeah, and I think you're right. So here's something. Have you ever seen the movie? And again, I like his work, but I haven't seen a lot of his movies. But it's a Lars von Trier movie, and I may have mentioned it in the last one, Melancholia.
Oh, yes. Yes, you did ask me about that. And I watched a scene or two of it, and I just couldn't take it anymore.
Oh, sorry. It is very dark, isn't it?
It's dark. That's not, I just found myself bored with it. And,
Oh,
my partner has told me, I don't know, 7 or 8 thousand times since we got together that this next movie she shows me is going to be the one that's going to turn me around and make me love movies. And so far, that hasn't worked for the last few thousand times, but I'm open to the next one being the good one.
well, here's my theory. Men who don't like movies probably dated more. But is it true in your case or false?
Well,
I don't know. I'm not asking you personally, but no, I like movies,
I
but
don't even know. I know more compared to what.
I don't
I
know.
was.
Well, me is easy. I'm a baseline close to zero, but more, from my perspective, more is a lot more than me. But that's horrible to think that way. The thing about Melancholia though is that there's this moment. Kirsten Dunst plays one of the main characters. In fact, she's the main character. And at the beginning of the movie, you get the sense that she's deeply depressed, deeply distressed. She can't really deal with life because life is still normal. And then halfway through the movie, as life becomes abnormal, she becomes healthier, if that makes any sense. And this is based upon, and this is a story. I don't know if this is true. It might be apocryphal, but what I heard was this: Lars von Trier was once talking with his therapist, and basically his therapist said, "Listen, I think people who are depressed deal better with crises than they do with normality. What do you think about that?"
That wouldn't surprise me at all. Because if, for one thing, if you're depressed, maybe your expectations are low. Maybe you're willing to take risks relative to people who are not depressed. And so maybe you'll dive in and do things, you'll take the risks that other people won't take. So that certainly wouldn't surprise me. I don't know a lot about human psychology. I I went to a psychology course for one semester as an undergraduate student, but I only went to 5 classes. I went to the first class, and then I went to the 4 classes during which there were exams. So I probably didn't learn much.
Well, I mean, you say that, but from listening to you, it does seem like you have an intuitive understanding of at least the features of the human psyche.
Are we trying to depress all of the listeners right now?
No, because we're gonna get to that next, Dr. McPherson. The really depressing part comes next, actually. Ugh.
It's interesting, and human psychology is bizarre, and I don't claim to be an expert by any stretch of the imagination. I hope I've made that perfectly clear. But even my own psychology is a mystery to me. And how people respond, everything I know about neurobiology, everything I know about so-called free will indicates that we don't have much, and that we are as programmed by our personal history and our genetics as other animals are, with maybe just a little bit of a smidgen of the ability to control our thoughts and our decision making. And so that if I were a philosopher, I'd put myself into the category of a Camus-like absurdist philosopher when it comes to how humans behave. And I I don't I don't blame people for the way they behave, because I've got this suspicion based on evidence that people don't have a lot of control over how they behave. In the moment, the response is to a large extent controlled or influenced or impacted by past personal history and genetics. And so I look at the whole thing from this absurdist perspective. I've made decisions that, looking back, were terrible, awful, horrible things. And later I wish I hadn't made them. But did I have any control over them at the time? It seemed like I did. I pondered, I thought, I cried myself to sleep at night. I moaned and pondered before I made these decisions. And then I made the wrong decision. And looking back, I thought that was a horrible thing. But maybe I didn't. Maybe I have as little control over that entire decision-making process as I accuse other people of having, which is not much. And so maybe I should learn to let some of that stuff go.
It's hard,
Easier
though.
said than done.
Well, it is. It's hard, though. And I think for someone like yourself and people like you, you've committed. Listen, I'm reasonably educated by standards of human existence now, which might not mean much, but you've committed your life to something that's big. It's like my cousin Michael. He teaches philosophy, and he committed his life to doing all the things that a professor's supposed to do. And when you think about it, that's a really tough place to be in 2020, not just because of the environment, but because of kind of everything. Like, even if you want to ignore the environment, it's hard to ignore the world that's right outside your door. And it's hard because you committed yourself to those things. Then someone comes along and says, well, you know what? All that stuff you committed yourself to was a castle of sand. All of it.
Right. And nobody wants to know that. Nobody wants to admit that to themselves. Nobody wants to share that information with other people, even though it seems like it might benefit the thought processes and the emotions of those other people. So, yeah, we find ourselves in difficult situations.
One of the things, and I think my listeners know this, related to that whole screed on normality, is that even though I live my life a certain way, I don't try to put it in people's faces, and I'm honest about the negative sides too. There's no free lunch. I don't believe in free lunches. And so even though I approach my life in a certain way, I try to talk about the good and the bad. Here's the thing, though. If you confront oblivion with a smile, people think you're an asshole.
I don't even have to do that for people to think I'm an asshole.
Well,
but yes, that certainly helps them make the case.
I've given you a whole new place to go. Well, I'm kidding. You've already probably been there. But yeah, that's my problem, especially around the holidays the last couple of years. If I'm around family, it's like if anybody asks me, I go to a Christmas celebration. I say, Dan, keep your mouth shut. Keep your mouth shut. Talk about movies, talk about something silly, talk about something ridiculous, but don't talk about what is kind of one of those things you're just deeply aware of, and that is the condition of human civilization. But what makes it worse is that when people see me talking, sometimes think, "Oh, Dan, you're happy about this," and it's like, "No, I'm not." I mean, if you look at the way I live, listen, there's a place called Uncle Ike's in Seattle, Dr. McPherson, and it's one of my favorite places. If I go there, it's not just that they have a gazillion kinds of cannabis products. They have a gazillion kinds of weed, okay, more than I can afford. And I know that that is going to cease to exist. It doesn't matter if you're right or not. I am convinced that even if you're wrong, you're still directionally correct. And normality is about to just blow up in our faces. So I look at that and I say, I am excited that I have $30 in my checking account because I can go to Uncle Ike's today and get some weed. And they think that's terrible. Why don't you care about your career? Why don't you invest in homes? Why are you so happy about the chaos? And I'm not happy about it because I want Uncle Ike's to be open, Dr. McPherson. You see what I'm getting at?
Of
I
course.
want it, yeah.
Of course, absolutely. And I've been accused of wanting civilization to collapse, of wanting our species to go extinct, of wanting all these things that nobody in their right mind would want. Of course not. I'm enjoying my life too much to have this go away. I don't have a lot of money at hand, but I still am able to enjoy life to a very great extent as it exists now. And I don't want to go back to a hair shirt. I walked away from active service at a major university where I was a success by every contemporary measure. And I grew my own food and lived off grid and did all those things that you're supposed to do if you're willing to make sacrifices. It made not a bit of difference. I lived that way for 10 years and then returned to the United States in part. And this has certainly been an advantage, even if it wasn't the primary motivator for me moving back to New York and now Central Florida, in part because it allows me to teach again in a different way than I was teaching before, not on a college campus, but through conversations like this one. And that's been an enormous privilege, and something that I really enjoy doing is having conversations like this one. The ability to do this is great and a wonderful outcome of returning to the quote civilized life with all this privilege that we've already talked about.
Well, don't call talking to me civilized. Don't be accusing me. Don't be accusing of me that, especially given your own perspective on the relationship between civilization and our current situation.
Right.
I'm kidding. I'm not going to bust your balls on that. But you in general do kind of think that things kind of went awry when the first city-states were formed, in a way, don't you?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. For the first, well, we don't know exactly how long, but at least 300,000 years of our species, Homo sapiens, on the planet, at least that first 300,000 years, we didn't have cities. We didn't have the ability to grow, store, and distribute grains at large scale. We didn't have the ability to lock up the food. And it's only been within the last few thousand years we've been able to do that. And I would argue that much of what has gone awry has been a result of the ability to lock up the food, as Dan Quinn calls civilization. So that's how he characterizes civilization, as the ability to grow, store, and distribute grains at large scale. And for him, that means locking up the food. And I tend to agree with that assessment.
Well, here's another thing. Like I said, I was talking to my friend yesterday, and I hope he's listening. And he was talking about, and again, he's half my age, so he's half your age. He's a lot younger, but he's a really good kid. And one of the things he thinks about that worried him in the past, and he's doing better now, is pointlessness. Like, why did he do the things he did? Why did he obey? Why did he go to school? He's really smart. Why does he read so many books? And I said to him, and this is my perspective because I'm not where you're at yet, Dr. McPherson. I'm not ready to say it's completely done. That doesn't mean I'm right, and I'm not gonna beat you up on it. It probably means I'm still in that sort of bargaining place in a way. But I said to him, listen, what if everything you've done, and I'd say this to you too, Dr. McPherson, what if everything you've done has not only not been futile, but maybe critical? And let me explain the thought experiment, Dr. McPherson. You know a lot more about this than I do, so you can call bullshit on me too. Imagine you have a salmon that's been in the Pacific for many years, right? Swimming through the Pacific. Now, salmon, when they go back to spawn, it's a slow process of going upriver, transitioning from high salinity zones to low salinity zones. But what if I went out and picked a salmon from the Pacific and dropped it in a freshwater lake? What would happen to that salmon?
The shock would be enormous. It would probably die quickly thereafter.
Yeah. My view on what you're doing, no matter if you're 100% correct or just mostly correct, which at this point being mostly correct is correct enough, what if what you're doing is helping people in a way deal with the shock? And in that sense, what you're doing is critical.
Well, sure. And it's because of my mistakes, because of the decisions I've made in the past, that allows me with some credibility to talk about the kinds of things we're talking about today. If I hadn't had that personal experience in living off grid, if I hadn't made those personal sacrifices, had I not given up on the monetary system, at least personally 11 years ago, then people would just treat me as another wayward pariah who doesn't have any practical experience in the things I talk about and therefore claim to know about. So, of course, it's that combination of bizarre events that have characterized my life that have made for a life, that have made for, in total, a life well worth living. Do I wish I'd done some things differently? Of course, I think most people fall into that category. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, we don't get to pick and choose. We don't get to go back in time. I want to go back to when I was 14 years old and I had this experience. Well, we don't get to do that, right? It's that combination of all those things that happen to us, with us, because of us, that makes us who we are. And so I'm not really in a position to complain about all that, much as it might come across that way now and then.
But it's helpful to me, Dr. McPherson, me personally. I do not believe there are people out there, and I think you'd agree, people with academic backgrounds, people with prestige. Maybe they're not even paid all the time, but there are people out there who do the opposite. They tell people it's all okay and there's no problems, and keep going to the mall, and we're going to have fusion energy and super robots, and we're all going to live on Mars, and we'll all drink martinis on Mars. There are people who do the opposite, and because of what I believe, because even though I'm not ready to say we're all dead, I do believe that most of us are going to be dead within 20 years. And when I say most, I mean more than 50%. So, and I gotta say, that's bad enough for most normal people. Like, it's kind of like Thanos is bad enough. If you say, we're going to kill half of everything, that's bad enough for a lot of people. At that point, it's really quibbling over details, whether it's half or everybody. I think that there are people like you. You're not the only one. I think you're one of the leading voices when it comes to extinction. But there are people like you who do the opposite. Even though, you might be wrong, but I don't believe you're operating from the basis of being wrong, which means that you're operating from the basis of integrity. And there are people like you who are helping people psychologically. I listen to people like the fellow Peter that you interview with sometimes. I like his podcasts.
Right.
He's a father, right? He's a dad.
Yeah, Peter Miller, he has 4 kids.
Yeah, that's a tough spot. And to be able to have a conversation like this, that no matter what happens, big picture, whether we're all completely extinct or whether just most of us are going to be dead within a few years, it's going to be horrible, and it will be even more horrible if no one has any conversations about it.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. Imagine and imagine the shock. Knowing what I know about the evidence, knowing that we're at the highest global average temperature experienced by our species on Earth, and that it could be just another third of a degree or half a degree quickly, and rate of change is really an important facet of this whole conversation. It could be that a relatively small increase in global average temperature will cause us to lose habitat for our species around the globe. Now, imagine that I knew that, and that I didn't tell the people I loved. Imagine that I had some idea of what was coming in the future, and I just shut my mouth about it. I didn't tell my family. I didn't tell my friends. And then it happens, right? So imagine that I can see that. Imagine we're in the ocean, and I can see in the distance a conflagration, and it looks like a boat that's on fire or an island's on fire, and we're headed right towards it, and I don't tell anybody. And we just wait until we get within 20 feet of it. And then I knew, but I didn't tell people. Imagine how they're going to feel about that. Wait a minute. You knew about this and you didn't tell us? You cobbled together all this evidence, all this information, and you didn't bother to tell us? And here we are at the precipice of the disaster, and we have had no way to prepare emotionally and intellectually for what we face now. So I think, that drives much of the work that I do, is promulgating this information, not because I'm trying to be mean to people, but because I've been organizing and compiling information like this for more than the last 30 years. And for me to forego passing that information on, I think would just be criminal.
I think it's important to think about that point, because it's kind of the question: do you tell them so that it's easier for them and harder for you, or do you keep your mouth shut so it's easier for you and harder for them?
Right. And undoubtedly, sometimes I have made it easier for myself and harder for other people than it needed to be. And there's that balance. that delicate balance of how we live our lives on a daily basis and what we tell the people around us. A student contacted me, this was years ago. She had gone to a presentation of mine, and she was taking the cab on the way home, and she thought, well, I have an obligation to tell this cab driver, yeah, we've never met, but geez, it just seems like the honest thing to do. And the poor cab driver has no context, right? He just picked up this woman to take her home to provide, to get a fare so that he could feed his family. And suddenly she's jabbering on about how we're all going to die within the next decade, 2 decades, whatever. And he kind of freaked out a little bit, as you can imagine. Yeah. And maybe she didn't approach that quite the right way.
Well, it is a shocking experience, like a salmon being dropped in the fresh water. Maybe, I don't really know the statistics on this because I don't want to believe any scientist was ever this monstrous. Maybe 1 in 10,000 times the salmon lives, but probably most times it doesn't, right?
Right. And so there's that balance, I'm probably more knowledgeable about the topic and willing to take the hits to my privilege than that poor student was those many years ago. And so at the very least, I've had more practice than she had had. So maybe I can handle the situation a little bit better than she did, with a little bit more nuance maybe than she did. We'll put it that way. But, we all face these kinds of situations on a pretty regular basis in our lives. We have access to information that not other people have, and it turns out to be important. So, for example, I just learned yesterday this little tidbit I was telling you before we got on the air. Apparently, one of the scientists at the Center for Disease Control indicated that if you do a little self-check, you just hold your breath every morning for 10 seconds. And if you can do that without coughing, without feeling a tightness in your chest, without having any untoward reaction to it, then that indicates that if you have the coronavirus, or apparently any other virus, it's not yet in your lungs. And so this is a simple thing that anybody can do, right? They can hold their breath for 10 seconds every morning. Of course, since I heard that, I've been holding my breath approximately every 10 minutes or so, just because I want to make sure, right? But it's a simple thing that I'm glad I know about. It's a simple little test. You can determine if your lungs are having any adverse reaction to anything going on. And it's simple to test and put yourself at ease by doing this simple test.
I like it. I'm going to probably, after this podcast, I will probably do a few tests. And because I suffer from OCD like my Father in heaven, I will probably do it every 5 minutes until I die. But thank you for telling me.
Oh, happy to share.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for giving me my path. I'm kidding. Here's the other thing, too. And again, this has been a weird, so hey, listeners out there, this was meant to be a bit of a wandering discussion, but a good one. This has been a bit of one, but the focus has been this general way that we confront. Like, how do we confront this thing? And here's the thing that I think is often the case, Dr. McPherson, and I was getting at it earlier a little bit, but I'd like to just directly look at it. When I'm talking to people, I don't think, especially, adults, decent, normal adults, which they still exist, like you, maybe me. I'm a bit of a drifter, a rascal, but maybe even me too. When I'm talking to decent, ordinary people who have confronted death, in general, they can process death. Like, my mom died, my dad died, my sister died. But what's really troubling to people? This idea that they could possibly live in a time where pretty much almost everyone they know dies. And this is a big struggle, because people can deal with the idea that they might die. But what if I told you, well, yeah, you're going to die, everyone you love's going to die, and there's going to be no one to bury you? I would never put it that way, but that's way worse in a lot of ways, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Are you kidding me? Everybody knows, and adults, for the most part, have accepted that they will die as an individual. But it's a long step not for a conservation biologist, it's a short step from individual death to the extinction of a species. But for most people, that's just a step too far. You're telling me every member of my family, all my friends, all of everybody I've ever known or will ever know, that the entire species is going to go extinct. So of course it sounds crazy. And I'll be the first person to admit it sounds crazy. If I didn't have my educational background in conservation biology, had I not taught courses in the subject and conducted research on the matter, then probably I'd have a hard time believing it myself.
So if I could get to something more practical, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but let's say I said, Dr. McPherson, I need to have a conversation with people I love, and the problem is the people I love, for the most part, have kids. How do I, if I've never had this conversation, and I'm not putting you on the spot to make this difficult for you, sir. This is just because I think you're prepared for this. I know you can answer it. But how do you begin that conversation?
That's a great question. I hear it on a pretty regular basis or something like it. And, I chose, to the extent that I think we choose anything, I chose not to have children a long time ago because it was relatively easy for me to see where we were headed as a species and as a planet in 1979 when I was 19 years old. And so I decided not to have children because I'd taken a biology course. How would I recommend other people tell their children? With compassion. Well, honestly, with as big a heart as you can possibly muster, because this is not easy. On the other hand, I have seen people tell their 5-year-old child. I saw a woman tell her 5-year-old child exactly what I know. And the child was so distraught and cried for easily 20 seconds and then started running around like a 5-year-old child again and giggling and laughing. And so, I don't know the best time to tell somebody. I think it depends upon the emotional and intellectual maturity of each child. I don't know whether to wait until you're sure it will stick. I don't know how to do that because I don't have those relationships.
But I'm not talking about the kids, and I'm sorry for interrupting you. I'm talking about the parents. How do you?
Oh,
I am sorry, I didn't phrase that right. How do you do this? How do you have that conversation with parents?
my partner has 3 grown children, and I think they don't like me very much. But my partner, I have the conversation with her obviously on a regular basis, and she is willing and able to look at the evidence. And so I guess what I would encourage people to do is to go to the evidence, not go to me as some sort of authority figure, but instead to go to the evidence. I'm frequently told that something like James Hansen disagrees with you about nuclear power. Okay, fine. So let's compare the evidence instead of the 2 people who are engaged in the discussion. Might even be an argument. So I try to point people towards the evidence now, the evidence that I'm aware of, and let them sort it out for themselves. I'm in no position to tell anybody that I know what the future looks like, because none of us knows what the future looks like, at least not in any detail. I think the science fiction writers like Bradbury and Orwell and Huxley pretty much had things figured out in the 40s and 50s. And things are playing out much as they saw in their most dystopian of moments. But they didn't get the details exactly right. You can't go find a person named Guy, as from Fahrenheit 451, who is doing the things that character was doing in the book. So I'm not sure what to say, except I try to point people toward the evidence and let them figure it out for themselves. I'm not trying to push anything down anybody's throats. I'm just trying to present the evidence that I'm familiar with and that I'm capable of dealing with. There's a whole lot that I'm not well educated to deal with, to teach other people about. So, When I tell you the story about holding your breath, that's just secondhand information from somebody at the CDC. I think it's probably right, but I'm no authority on the topic. He also said to take a drink of water every 15 minutes, because then if any virus that is in your mouth gets washed down into your stomach and your stomach acid tears it all up, it's problem solved. But I'm no authority.
But you have a PhD. You have a PhD, so everything you say must be true.
No, I have a PhD in a relatively narrow field of knowledge, and that makes me pretty well qualified to evaluate the evidence on some topics, and not at all qualified to evaluate evidence on other topics. And one of those topics that I'm not well qualified to talk about is viruses that are in your mouth and how to get rid of them by swallowing water. I think that's probably accurate based on everything I know about biology, but I'm not an internal medicine kind of guy. I don't study stomachs.
And that's the thing. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I have to say that it is a challenge, especially once I listen to someone like you, to figure out, okay, practically speaking, I have, 7 other siblings, 6 that are still alive. And, when my sister Nancy and my mom died of cancer, I think our whole family got a rude awakening about, if any of us was delusional about the nature of reality, I think watching my sister die of cancer helped all of us with that. It's kind of horrible, but it's the truth. But the fact is, I don't really know how to have a conversation, evidence or not, because the problem with the evidence, Dr. McPherson, is people's eyes will glaze over, even the intelligent people, maybe even especially the smart people, because they spend their days like when I was really into my field as a software engineer, I spent my day dancing with abstract ideas, having fun in my mind, working with the application of math to the real world. I didn't want to hear about shit that you talk about. In fact, I recall the conversation from more than 10 years ago when I think your name came up and I was having Mexican food and I said, listen, can I just drink my beer and eat my Mexican food?
That's great.
Well, I'd rather if the beer was good, the Mexican food was good, but that topic was horrible. It's like, what do you do with extinction?
It still is horrible, by the way.
Well, I'm not saying it is or it isn't. It's just, what do you do with it? I mean,
Right.
how
And
do you go ahead?
and so you're absolutely right. Some people say I'm a terrible person because if everybody's going to die, why would you bother telling anybody? And other people very much appreciate this message. They very much appreciate knowing that they too have an expiration date and that I have reminded them, for the most part, that it's closer than they thought. It encourages people to live with urgency. It encourages people to complete relationships in their lives that they might otherwise not complete. I never have liked Aunt Sally, and I've wanted to have this conversation with her for the last 40 years, tell her exactly where I think she went wrong and blah, blah, blah. And now I'm going to do it so that when I die or when she dies or when we're in a position that we're not talking to each other anymore, I have this thing that's unsaid. I don't want to have this thing that's unsaid. So I'm going to go talk to Aunt Sally and I'm going to tell her I love her and I've loved her this whole time, but man, did she ever screw that up 40 years ago. You know what I mean? And so this is not easy. It's not easy for anybody. But I think most people are going to be at peace to a far greater extent when they are drawing their last breath if they have completed relationships in their lives. If they don't have a bunch of stuff left hanging on that they wish they had dealt with.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. In fact, I think it's simply true what you just said. I would say relationships are one component. It's definitely one of the most important components because of what we are biologically. But definitely it's one of those things where you say, well, I had a fight or I said something terrible. Dr. McPherson in 2017, I tried to get off the grid, so to speak. And I tried to sort of find a way out of the system. And in the process, I went a little bit crazy. I'm not going to lie. And in the process, on a particular day, I said some really terrible things to somebody that didn't deserve it. And I also made a threat I never intended to execute on, but it was shitty. It was shitty what I said. And every day since then, I've wanted to say, how can I make up for this? And I know from talking to somebody that this person's moved on, that this is probably no longer even an issue for that person. But it's shitty that that's sticking in my head, if that makes any sense.
Right, absolutely. Based on a whole bunch of conversations, it seems that people have regrets as they're dying about things they did or said, and also about things they didn't do. So people regret having not taken that river trip down the Colorado River, having not gone skydiving, having not done all these things. Well, one of the things that I'm encouraging people to do is to do those things. Do those things that you say you've always wanted to do, but you just keep pushing them aside because life gets in the way. You got to go to work every day. You got to deal with this and that and the other thing. And I just don't want people to be lying on their deathbed thinking, I should have done those 7 things, and I don't know what your 7 things are that's on your so-called bucket list or your complete the relationships list or whatever you want to call it. But I'm pretty sure a lot of people have those things that they have not done that they're going to regret when the system no longer allows them to do those things.
100% agree. We are at an hour, but I was wondering, could we go a bit longer? Is that okay with you?
Yes.
Okay. So I got a couple more sort of subjects I'd like to deal with. One is kind of big, maybe, but maybe you'll knock it out and very quickly. Is there, and this is where I want to switch from confronting this horrible thing to taking steps, which you do talk about in terms of confrontation, but I'm going to switch it a little bit further afield. Is there anything we could do? I'm not saying to save ourselves. That's off the table right now. Is there anything we could do to make sure that life has a chance once we're gone?
I think so. I think there are a couple of things we can do. I think that we need to change the set of living arrangements quite profoundly, and that won't be enough. I think we need to ensure that the world's nuclear power plants do not melt down catastrophically in our wake or even while we are here, because I think that's about as far down the road of worst case possibility as we can get. I think the genetic impacts on all life on Earth as a result of the nuclear power plants melting down in an uncontrolled manner are absolutely horrific and might well terminate all life on Earth. In addition, there's the 5 to 6 degree temperature rise pointed out by Strona and Bradshaw in their paper in November 2018, indicating that temperature rise will destroy all life on Earth. You don't even need the catastrophic meltdown of the world's nuclear power plants to lose all life on Earth. How do we do that? I'm working with engineers, most notably one at Harvard, to try to compensate for the loss of the aerosol masking effect or global dimming when we stop putting so much fossil fuel emissions into the atmosphere. And I'm committed enough to that project to continuing conversations and to try to get people who have access to people with wealth, with real money, with Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and Jeff Bezos style wealth, to contact those people and fully fund the individual at Harvard so that he can spend essentially all of his time working on what I think is the most important project in the history of our species so far. So, will it work? I'm not sure. I'm not convinced. But I know it won't work if we don't do it. And nobody is doing it. Nobody knows how to do it except for this one individual who's a faculty member at Harvard and a relatively small group of people who are working with him. So let's try to make that happen, not merely to save our own species, but to maybe interrupt the ongoing mass extinction event and prevent the loss of all life on Earth. I think that's a worthy enough cause that we could be throwing a lot more money at it than we are. And if I was somebody like Bezos or Buffett or Gates, somebody who had access to a lot of money that is not going to matter when we're all dead, but I had children as well, that, this is the kind of thing that I'd be wanting to know more about. And if there's a safety outlet, if there's a safety valve, that I'd want to know about it, and I'd want to start funding it like years ago to the extent possible.
I'm glad I asked you this because listen, my listeners are a lot like me. In fact, in many ways, they're simply like me, but more optimistic. They think things will get tough, but they're convinced that there's a way for them to get through it with their family. And I respect that because these are mostly parents. And even though that may be a little bit delusional, I get it because they're parents. They love their kids. And so they want to try to figure out a way through this. I don't believe what you're saying is we can all be okay. But you are saying that with respect to life itself, there might be forms of stewardship that we can take now to at least give life a fighting chance.
Yes. And I think that's worthy.
So
go ahead.
I think
it's worth doing almost anything to ensure that there will be continued life on Earth. Some 4 billion, 5 billion years into life on Earth, we have the ability to destroy it forever. Let's not do that. Let's throw everything else we can possibly think of at it. When I played basketball in high school and even for a year in college, the coaches would always scream something like, "Leave it all on the floor." If you get tired, we have somebody who can replace you. But don't hold back. And this is one of those moments in planetary history that we're not talking about a basketball game. We're talking about life on Earth.
Yeah, it's the thing though is that it's a big, big, big battle. It's kind of frightening to know that it's possible to come up with situations where the human race will be motivated to do something like build an atom bomb. But it's funny that when it comes to something helpful, it's very difficult to get people to do anything. And full disclosure, Dr. McPherson, I am an agorist, a voluntarist. I personally think government is most of the reason why we're in this mess, specifically debt-driven government. Living beyond your means, especially for a pinnacle predator, an apex predator, is a formula for destruction. Wouldn't you agree that predators have to live within their means?
Absolutely. And we as a society have made a point of not living within our means, and that carries over to most individuals within society. I've been saying for 30 years in my college classes that the typical American, to the extent there is such a thing, has their spending rise to meet their income and then go a little bit further.
It's true. And that's, it's true. That's true. Yeah.
And, you play that out not just at the monetary level, but the level of society, at the level of the way we do every single thing. And of course, it points to disaster.
So before we go, I'd like to talk about one more thing, and it's more about the technical issues. And I am not putting you on the spot. That's not how I play. But I am going to put you on the spot a little because kind of, I'm going to paraphrase Carl Sagan, he said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I think that's generally true. And I would say claims as big as the ones you make, they do require a lot of evidence. And I will say further, I've been to your website, I've listened to enough of your lectures. You have the evidence, at least in my opinion, to form a judgment for yourself and others. It may be the case there's more than one interpretation because that's the nature of evidence. But I believe you've done the research, okay? But it's one of those situations where people say, okay, let's talk about something. And this is something we talked about the last podcast, and I think it's worthy to focus on because of this COVID. Do you think that it's possible, and I'm not holding you to this, but you think it's possible that we are looking at a tipping point event because of the economic slowdown?
Yes, I do. And I've done short video clips, not at all comprehensive, but short video clips on this topic on my blog, guymcpherson.com, posted on January 28th and then on February 28th. Not by design, just coincidentally. And the evidence from the scientific community, in this case published in Science, which is a big deal, in February of last year, 2019, by Rosenfeld and colleagues, indicates as little as a 20% reduction in industrial activity will cause a 1 degree Celsius global average temperature rise. Remember, we're right now at the highest global average temperature experienced by Homo sapiens since we got here. And we've known that since 2017, according to a paper by James Hansen and colleagues. So to have us experience an abrupt global average rise in temperature as a result of a reduction in the aerosol masking effect would, in my opinion, be catastrophic. So we're talking about a 1 degree Celsius global average temperature rise in a matter of a very short period of time. Contrast that with the approximately 1 3/4 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in 1750. So an additional 1 degree in a short period of time will almost certainly be sufficient to destroy habitat for Homo sapiens on Earth. Is that going to happen as a result of the coronavirus and the resulting diminution of industrial activity? I'm not certain. It looks like we're headed that way. When the European Union comes together and a bunch of airlines in Europe are now flying ghost flights, they are requiring the planes to continue flying even though there's no people on them. Yeah,
Sorry,
no kidding.
I'm sorry.
Right? And you look at that, and then you look at the many reports that have come out recently indicating that Chinese industries are keeping the shops running, burning coal, with no people showing up to work. So the people are too sick. They're essentially self-quarantining. They aren't going to work, but the manager is going to the shop today and keeping everything running. Got to keep burning that coal to maintain the aerosol masking effect. When I see those two large-scale activities going on in Europe and in Asia, it makes me think that there's a reason behind that, and the reason has to do with the virus and the subsequent reduction in the aerosol masking effect. So, it's really interesting to be in a position where we're actually cheering for burning coal to maintain the aerosol masking effect when we know that burning coal is catastrophe writ large when we do it at this kind of scale we're doing it. But I think that we truly are in a desperate time here, and desperate times call for desperate measures. So I see what's going on in China and in Europe with the industrial activity and the airlines, respectively. And I really think that's a result of the governmental and perhaps even corporate knowledge of the aerosol masking effect and what its reduction means for us as a species. So I'm not passing judgment, by the way, on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I just see it playing out. And I've got to think that that's a result of wanting to not have a reduction in the aerosol masking effect that would cause an abrupt environmental change sufficient to cause the demise of our species and many others.
And it's interesting. I had already read about the same thing about China, which when I read about it, I thought this is really weird. But the thing you mentioned about the airlines, that's weird too. And the first thought I had about, the situation in China was, crap, this sounds a lot like the kind of nonsense you'd do if you suspected that if you didn't do it, the situation would get worse along the lines of what Dr. McPherson has talked about. The first thing that occurred to me, my interpretation wasn't the absurdity of communism. That would have been my interpretation 10 years ago. my interpretation was, crap, they can't turn these things off. They can't.
Right. And I think that's exactly where we're at. We're in this situation where we have to turn off industry because it's killing all life on Earth. And yet, if we do, it will kill all life on Earth faster. So we have to turn off industry, and yet we can't turn off industry. It's really rather inconvenient.
It is, but it's also absurd, and that full circle sense, it's something that a guy like Camus could probably appreciate.
Absolutely.
Camus, every existentialist would, but especially Camus.
Right, absolutely. And that's what drives me every day further into the Camus camp with respects to absurdity and existentialism.
That's a good place to be. Here's the thing. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but last summer, getting back to one of my oh shit moments, last summer, when I would look north from Microsoft campus, it looked like the entire northern hemisphere had turned orange and brown. It looked like the sky. I mean, the only feeling I had from looking at the sky due to the north of me last summer was there's something ominous happening around the Arctic Circle. And I can't imagine. And in the summer before, and this is the thing, I moved back to Seattle in 2017. I shook my fist at God and said, I'll never move back. And I did. And 2018, the summer, I grew up here, Dr. McPherson. You don't have to believe me, I grew up here. There was never a time in Washington State where I had a hard time breathing. Never, ever, ever, ever. The summer of 2018, I would get home from work on a hot day and walk from the bus station, and I would be panting by the time I got home. And it's like, what the hell is going on? What the hell is going on? Why is the air so bad?
Must be the work.
Yeah, exactly. It must be that. It must be that. When you see an orange-brown sky and you expect to see a clear sky, what do you do with that? How do you interpret that? And this is where I'm not going to beat up on you, but this is where people like you, and I know you don't, but people like you and maybe people like me take things for granted because you've been able to do all this thinking and all this research. But again, getting back to that shocking event, what is it like for a person when they have enough intelligence to know that something looks wrong, but not enough knowledge to understand why?
Yeah, it's terrible. It's terrible even if you do have enough knowledge to understand why. Because what you discover is almost always terrible.
It is. And here's the other thing, too. You know what noctilucent clouds are, right?
Yes.
Okay. And these things do happen throughout, it's not necessarily by itself a feature of modernity. But one of the things that happens when you produce a lot of methane and other gases that sort of get released, like nitrous oxide, is you end up with these weird clouds in the way up in the atmosphere that, where they essentially, it's like ice crystals, and these weird clouds, they glow, and they glow because cosmic rays are hitting them, and it's weird. And one person could look at a noctilucent cloud, and believe me, I've read articles where it says, oh, these things are beautiful. And like, you'll read an article, and the article will read like this, Dr. McPherson. Hey guys, it's going to be a great week. We're going to have all these beautiful clouds at night, so get out and look at them. And I'm thinking to myself, do you guys understand what this might be?
Right, and there are several references to noctilucent clouds in my long essay, Climate Change Summary and Update, for which there's a tab at guymcpherson.com. And I stopped updating that essay in 2016, now almost 4 years ago, for a couple of reasons. One, I was living in Belize, and the infrastructure there is very poor, so it became essentially impossible for me to update it on a regular basis. And also because I was done. The case had been made. If in more than 30,000 words with thousands of links to the peer-reviewed literature, you don't believe that our species can go extinct, then there's nothing I can say or write or do that will convince you. So I just sort of quit then and started updating another essay instead. So maybe I'm not very good at quitting.
Well, it's kind of good not to quit. It's actually kind of courageous at this point, in my opinion, to be willing to, I don't know how to phrase this, but to be willing to not give up in that sense. But at the same time, given the battle you've had, I would understand. Listen, everyone needs to take a break. And also, just because you're aware doesn't make you responsible. It's one of the things that people sometimes, I think you're good at this, but there are a lot of activists who aren't always good at this. They're aware and they try to help, but then they internalize. They say, "Oh, well, crap, it's my fault." And it's like, no, it's not. This is not. In fact, the word fault might not even be a good word. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. I've been trying to discourage people from casting blame and guilt and shame for years now, because I just don't see where that does us any good. Yeah, it makes me feel better if I can claim something is your fault, something adverse is your fault. Beyond that, does it help? Does it help you? Does it help the situation? I see a lot of cases where it doesn't.
It's very counterproductive. It's one of the things that makes, it's one of the reasons why, in my humble opinion, the environmentalist movement has failed, because they have been so focused on placing blame that they have lost touch with how do we fucking fix this.
Absolutely. Yes, it's all your fault, therefore I don't have to do anything.
And
That
it's, and
doesn't,
it's, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, it doesn't help.
It doesn't help. It's like this, like, okay, you say, for example, well, Dan, when the city states locked up the food, that was the big fuck up. And I'm not beating you up on this because I like your position. I like Quinn's position. But what if I said, come on, Dr. McPherson, I'm just an old drunk fool drifter in Little Saigon, but you know something I know. Nature's not linear, okay? There's a reason why for the first whatever 100,000 years we were walking around picking our butts and whatever, because nature's not linear. And when those non-linear things happen, it can be catastrophically good and catastrophically bad depending on your perspective, right?
Absolutely. And also, if I point out that it was when we started locking up the food, when we started growing and storing and distributing grains at scale, that's where the problems occurred. That doesn't mean I'm telling you or anybody else that it's game over, right? That doesn't mean that we should just, well, okay, there's nothing to be done except party like it's 1999, right?
Exactly.
That's not the point at all.
And again, I'm not telling, even though I've made my own personal life choices, which include doing some of the things you say. When I was 20, I wrote something, and I made the mistake of showing it to the wrong person because I had a really low self-esteem. So the combination of the wrong person and a low self-esteem, I didn't do much writing for another 20 years. And in my early 40s, I said, fuck it. I might be a shitty writer. I might be okay. But if I don't do it now, when the hell am I going to do it? And this was before I was thinking about your scenario. This is when I simply believed that the situation was untenable, that whatever was coming was going to be chaos. This is long before I even considered the possibility that this could be the last hurrah. Your message, there are two things coming out of this podcast today that really I hope my listeners get, and I hope they see as positive. Number one, your message is not to give up, correct?
Right. No, I'm not encouraging anybody to stop doing what they're doing or to give up on preserving life on Earth. As a conservation biologist, what else would I be living for if not to try to preserve life on Earth?
But you're also saying it is also okay and maybe even synergistic to say, you know what? Why are you postponing all this shit you say you're going to do once you retire? Why are you
Right.
postponing it?
Absolutely. And for many, many years, long before I started talking about the things we're talking about today, I was telling students that they should retire as soon as they get out of college. For 20 years. I think the system should have been set up that way. So there's government support for people to retire somewhere between the ages of 18 and 25. Take 20 years off. And then when you come back, after you've lived inexpensively backpacking all over Europe, seeing all those things you want to do, when your body is still in good enough condition that you can actually do them and enjoy them, then go back to work. And then you have to work for the rest of your life from now on. Why wait until you're 65 years old and your body is broken to try to enjoy life? Let's do that today.
I kind of like that front-loading retirement. Kind of makes a lot of sense when you think about it. But it's very counterintuitive for a lot of people.
Oh, yeah. Well, and it would have the adverse effect from the corporate perspective of getting a bunch of 40, 45-year-old people who aren't so easily indoctrinated as your workforce. And maybe some of those people would realize this is the shittiest deal ever, and I'm just not going to, if my life from now on is going into this job I hate forever, then I'm just going to end my life right now. That would not be good for corporate profits.
No. And here's the other thing too. Um, I One of the most horrifying things of my existence is that when I finally found a career that would make me happy, I thought my career found a way to make me sad, which is to say that I love programming computers. I gotta say, I love it. I love solving problems. It's something I enjoy. But about 10 years ago, work in my industry started becoming less about solving problems and more about, for lack of a better word, bullshit. And all of a sudden, it was like my joy of doing something had been completely squeezed out of it, completely. You
Right.
know,
And why bother? If you can't experience joy, then I think you're doing something wrong. I think maybe it's time to consider changing your life.
very true. Before we go today, Dr. McPherson, I would like to give you a chance to talk about your website, to talk about any upcoming events, and also to talk about how people can help you. I will say this right now. I don't have a lot of money. If I did, I would definitely donate to you because I think what you're doing is good stuff. I know you're not religious, and I'm just going to say this. I think you're doing God's work. You may not know it, but you are. I think you're doing the kind of thing that people should do. You're telling the truth as you see it, and you're a straight shooter, and I think you're a good man. So before we go ahead and talk about your website and talk about how people can help you talk about what you need to discuss with people.
Well, thank you, Dan. I appreciate that very much. My website is at guymcpherson.com, and you can find everything there, including video, my writing for Weekly Hubris, which is paradoxically a monthly e-zine. And you can also find a donate button there. So you can send me money if you're so inclined. And I would greatly appreciate it. I'll even send you a thank you note back. You can read my books, all of which are listed at guymcpherson.com. And beyond that, there are countless things that people can do to help me get out what I think is the most important message in the history of our species. You can subscribe to my partner's YouTube channel, and if you're a film editor, you can help her with working on her documentary film that she's putting together. What do I have going on personally? I usually don't talk about personal things during interviews, but
Oh, you don't.
it's
Hey, you don't have to. You don't have to go personal. I meant more like
no,
if
no,
you're in a
no,
lecture or something. Okay, go
no,
ahead.
no, no. I want to talk about this because it fits with what we said. For many years, I've wanted to float down the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon, and I just never made time to do that. Somebody I've never met contacted me and by email and said, "Hey, you want to float down the Colorado River and you blame getting more than 400 email messages a day for not going down the Colorado River. Well, we're going to stop that nonsense right now. I'm going to pay all your expenses to float down the Colorado River. My only demand is that I get to go on the trip with you." And so I thought that was great. And so this is, if we're still here in mid-November, in mid-July, then I will actually accomplish something, and I won't have that thing hanging over me when I die that says, I always wanted to do that, but I never did it. So here's one of those cases where I'm actually putting somebody else's money where my mouth is, which works out great. And I'm actually taking the time to float the Colorado River and ignore 420 email messages a day for 10 days. I can't even imagine what that's going to look like when I get back. So maybe I just won't look. Maybe I'm just going to tell people before I leave, don't send me an email message. If you do, I'm just going to delete it when I come back. Anyway, we'll see.
Now, please don't be upset, but I had at least one, maybe two horrible thoughts when you told me that story. One is crap. Um, what if it's somebody who wants to drown you? I know that sounds okay. I'm a dark person, and I think you're okay with that. But
Well,
I thought,
well,
crap, what if it's that, man?
she's 66 years old, and I think I can take her.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of spry older people.
I don't
Okay,
know. I
and I
said I
gotta say,
think I can take her.
it's
I don't
about
know.
it's about strategy too. Okay, you can do a lot with brains versus brawn. I get your point, though. I get your point. The other horrible thought I had was, um, I got divorced in 2013, and again, I don't hold anything against my ex-wife. I hope that she's okay. That's all I can say. But on our honeymoon, we went rafting. Our honeymoon was in Alaska, and we went rafting on the 6 Mile River. And at the time, the water temperature was, I think, 39 degrees, and it was a class 4 and 5 river. And we'd never been rafting. And the other problem was our rafts were underloaded. So basically, our rafts were less stable because there were fewer people in them. We went early in the season. And the very first set of rapids we hit, I got thrown out. And we were in a canyon. So there's really no place where you could like crawl out of the river. And I got stuck in a whirlpool. And I don't know how close I got, but it was the closest I felt like I ever got to drowning. So the two thoughts I had was, crap, someone might try to kill him, one, and two, you know what? Rafting trips don't always turn out okay, Dr. McPherson.
Right, right. So I could die. And, I have lived an adventurous life for a very long time. If I drown in the Colorado River because I'm doing something I've wanted to do for a long time, what a way to go. As Homer pointed out some 2,800 years ago in the Iliad, any moment might be your last. And why not do it while floating down the Colorado River? Because if I drown, or if my sponsor and colleague decides that she wants me to die on this trip, whatever, man. I've had a good run. I just turned 15. I just had my 15th birthday 10 days ago. So I've had a good run. I'm 60 years on the planet in 9 days.
Well, you know something? I like what you're saying. I am, all jokes aside, I think you're going to have a good time. I think you're going to be here in July. I also think there's a good chance that this summer could get really crazy as far as what we're going to see. But I don't know. I don't know. And I have less data than you do to know. So I'm not going to even claim I could know. Before we go, I would like to say thank you, and I'd also like to say this, if it's okay with you, I think I said this the last time, I wouldn't mind doing this for as long as we could, once a month or every couple months, if it's okay with you.
It's great with me, Dan. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you, and you bring up good questions. And you constantly are saying something like, I don't mean to put this on you, I don't mean to attack you, but what about this?
Well, I'm not really. I think that the thing is, I am aware, I am sensitive to the fact that there are people out there who are so afraid that they attack you. And I think that you have the wisdom to know that in most cases, it isn't hate, it isn't anger, it's fear.
Right,
You know what I mean?
absolutely. And our entire society has been based on fear for a very long time. So it shouldn't come as a big surprise after many, many years of using fear to motivate people that it turns out to be an excellent motivator. So, of course, I'm not surprised to see that sort of thing happen.
And I would also say this, because my listeners know this. I'm not trying to be a silly person, but I try to keep an open mind in a non-silly way. And so even though I might, entertain the possibility that you are right, I still reserve the right to think about it myself, as any person should. And what I try to do is say, listen, guys, if you believe that Dr. McPherson is wrong, then you should still have the courage to listen. Does that, you know what I'm saying?
Yes, and by the way, nobody wants to be wrong more than me. So please show me the evidence.
Yeah. Well, for Monday, and everyone loves a Monday, for Monday, March the 9th, 2020, this is the Little Saigon Report. I want to thank you, Dr. McPherson, for being on, and just, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate it.